Welcome back to Pandemic Pass. If you missed parts 1 and 2 of this episode, be sure to download my conversations with Congressperson Bobby Scott in part 1 and Delegate Janelle Wilkins in part 2. You don't want to miss those conversations. They really were awesome. My name is Casey Siddons, and you are listening to Pandemic Pass. And in the last part of this fourth episode of Pandemic Pass, which is titled The Way Out, you know, our public school system is hurting, and I don't think we have really taken the time to take stock as to how much hurt there is on our institution of public education. And while Ed is certainly not dead, it's going to need many fixes and repairs throughout the coming years to really adequately recover from this crisis. For part 3, I bring in Dr. Josh Starr, and one of the reasons why I wanted to talk with Dr. Starr is because I believe, and I think you'll agree, I believe his clarity and empathy as a leader lends itself quite well to this particular crisis that we currently find ourselves. And I'll tell you a little bit about Dr. Starr's background in just a minute. He's currently the Chief Executive Officer of PDK International. With Dr. Starr, his experience as a school superintendent and now as head of a national organization whose aim is really to elevate the teaching profession and expand and diversify the teaching force, they're at the vanguard of helping repair the image of public schools, in my opinion, in terms of bringing in a wider array of teachers and bringing in new perspectives. I think, even though that's maybe not their number one cause, I think that's what they're doing. And really, they're trying to build back the teaching force from the attrition that has occurred over the past year. I think Dr. Starr will talk about the long game, as you'll hear in our conversation. But really, they've been working at this for quite a while, and there's been some hurt in this area on public schools for quite a while, and I think this particular pandemic is showing the wounds that have been around for quite some time. So about my guest today, Dr. Starr. As I said, he's the CEO of PDK International. He's been there since 2015. And under his leadership, PDK has really expanded the Educators Rising program. If you haven't heard a bit about it, go ahead and Google it. I'll put it in the show notes as well. Across the nation, which seeks to build up our teaching force and increase teacher retention. He's the author of a number of essays and op-eds, and he writes a monthly column that I highly recommend. It's called On Leadership for Kappan. And again, I highly recommend you check it out. Prior to joining PDK, Dr. Starr was superintendent of schools in Montgomery County Public Schools in Maryland, which is the 14th largest school district in the United States. And he was also superintendent of schools for Stamford in Connecticut. This part of episode 4 really is the on-the-ground view of, as I was saying, the title of this episode is The Way Out. And the entire premise of this particular 3-part episode is getting to this point. So thanks for sticking with me on this, and I hope you enjoy it. It's a really great interview, great discussion. It was great reconnecting with Dr. Starr, and enjoy, and we'll see you on the flip side. Dr. Joshua Starr, thank you so much for joining us on the Pandemic Pass. I'm so glad to have you on our show and to have this discussion with you today. What do you see as our state of public education right now?
Well, first, Casey, thanks for having me on. It's really a pleasure, and I'm happy to support the work you do and leadership that you've always shown. So I think we are at a place right now where there are some really fundamental questions facing public education that the pandemic has forced us to reckon with the number one issue being the inequities. People now see them in ways that those of us who've been in the business have always known and always seen, but when we now see that there isn't broadband access for some kids, that other kid, that this tension around, do you have to have the camera on if someone doesn't want to show their background, like the food issues, the hunger issues. So I think that the inequities are slapping us in the face in ways, or America in the face in ways that hopefully will continue to be part of the dialogue when we do come back in and recover. Say, wait a second, and we know we're going to have to catch kids up. And then the the flip side of that is we're seeing the hyper entitlement of privileged parents on steroids now, and with learning pods, with some of the alignment, and the difference between who wants to keep schools open, who wants to keep them closed. So we're seeing like all that is coming out more and more, I think. The other really interesting conversation I think is happening, and John Mehta from Harvard wrote a fabulous piece in the New York Times the other day about making schools more human. I think we're taking this opportunity to say, what's the real purpose of school, and how does it serve society, and what should we be doing going forward? I wrote about this, at EdNext the other day around standardized testing. Like, this is an opportunity to think about what aspects of pre-COVID weren't working and should frankly be done away with, and what have we learned during the COVID environment that can be kept? What's the role of technology? Even just some of the communications and efficiencies. I have one friend who jokingly said after the parent-teacher conferences on Zoom back in the fall, she's like, I never want to go to a parent-teacher conference in person again. Zoom was the best thing ever because I didn't, and I don't know what it's like as a teacher. Agree. Well, yeah, and you're right. And part of it is you don't have to sit there and listen to that one parent who says, my kid, Casey, kind of struggled, or that story, right?
Yes.
So I think so how do we, that's a small little issue, but I think there are these questions like, wait a second, teachers now, you have to use technologies in ways that they didn't have to before. How can they incorporate? So I would hope that we would have a real conversation about not only the gross inequities that must be addressed in our funding systems, in our resource allocation systems, sure. And all of that, but also like what's possible, what have we learned? And I think that hopefully, there's going to be an opportunity to do so. We don't know what the new administration will bring to it, frankly.
Right.
But at the local levels where all the action happens, I hope that the good leaders can organize their teachers and their families to really think about what have we learned and what should we do going forward. And I'll just end on this, and I've written about this as well. I do think that this is the opportunity for teacher leadership to be at the forefront of what's next. And if there were ever a time to let those who are closest to the problem solve the problem, this is it. And I think we'll see more of that.
Yeah, that's really well said. I think, as much as it seems like Zoom teaching and learning have gotten busier than when we were in person, I think we have really an opportunity and time and space to think about how we as our school systems move forward. And on that note, like in your former role as superintendent of one of the largest school districts in the country, what are your takes and opinions on how systems can most effectively emerge from this pandemic, and what kind of things would you prioritize in terms of coming budget constraints, staffing issues, mental well-being of staff and students, et cetera?
So I think that there's two ways of looking at that question. One is the what, and the second is the how. The what is addressing the needs of the most vulnerable kids and families first. There's no excuse to not know where every single child is and what their family condition is. There's enough resources in Montgomery County and every other school district in America to say we must account for every single child and every single family and have a plan to support them, whether that's food insecurity, whether it's housing insecurity, whether it's mental health, whether it's physical health. There's just no excuse for that. I think this is going to be the time also then to create individual plans for every child. We've talked about that before, but really you should account for every single kid and say, what are they going to need? Is it going to be reading? Is it going to be mental health? Is it going to be mathematics? Whatever it may be. Mm-hmm. So that's one. And then that's the what. And then the how is going to be who gets to make the decisions. And, places like Montgomery County, and this is part of what I was trying to bust up a little bit, have been very centralized and very command and control. And there's a consistent way of doing business, which does create efficiencies and does create accountability. And there's some elegance to that model, but those who are closest to the kids and the families need to be making decisions about what kids need and how those services should be delivered. We don't rely on our teachers enough to make decisions. We don't rely on our support professionals enough. We rely way too much on standardized assessments rather than the authentic information that teachers have about kids. So that's a process question that leaders have to learn how to organize that way. But I think that going back in and thinking about what the summer is going to look like, organizing around the non-negotiable question of what are we doing to ensure that our most vulnerable kids have everything they need first, and making that a political issue, right? I mean, there's a politics to that. Then helping leaders at the school level work with their communities in authentic ways to bring their intelligence and thought and creativity to bear on that, I think is going to be what we need to do going forward.
Yeah, and I think in terms of, bringing in the teachers, the folks who are face-to-face with kids every day, seeing what works and doesn't work. I mean, starting at the ground level of saying, what can we do that is working for kids? What should we stop? What should we continue? I think is super important. So, as what you're doing now as CEO of PDK International, it's an organization that I'm quoting from the website. It supports teachers and school leaders by strengthening their interest in the profession, something that I've had a personal interest in for quite some time. Yeah. What role do you see your organization playing in the recovery and build back of public schools at large?
So I think there are two things. One is through the magazine, Kaplan Magazine, which sits at the intersection of research, policy, and practice. We are trying to get good, practicable information out into the field so that practitioners as well as policymakers can have a sense, can know what works. Like what do you actually need to do in order to support kids? What do you need to do in order to increase your number of teachers of color? Like whatever it may be, like we want to just put good information out into the field so that people have the resource so they can make evidence-based decisions. The other thing, of course, is the work we're doing with Educators Rising, which is seeking to both address the teacher shortage that we have looming in the country, but also diversify the profession. And as more and more folks are recognizing how important both of those aspects are, we don't yet know what the numbers are going to be with people taking early retirement or, the shortage numbers have been seen for years, and they've been certainly evidenced in about a 35% decrease in teacher prep program enrollment. I don't know what it looks like in Maryland, but I'm sure it's about the same. We have a real problem, and we have to diversify. And we've got solutions around that nobody else has. So we're continuing to just be focused. We're continuing to be focused on that. And I'm hoping that the new Cardona administration, the Biden-Harris administration, are going to really be embracing that, which we expect they will. And that's how we're hoping to help.
Yeah, it helps having VP Harris coming from Howard University, one of many HBCUs that provide a lot of teachers and folks who are working in schools across the country. So that's awesome. And one of the main programs, as you mentioned, of PDK International is the Ed Rising program, whose goal is to foster a pipeline of diverse and highly qualified educators into schools. I read recently that we're about to face 100,000 teacher shortage across the nation. And I imagine we're probably going to be seeing a lot more of teacher attrition this year. To what extent do you see the efforts and guideposts of Ed Rising changing in the coming months, if at all?
Yeah, so we are, the challenge, frankly, with Ed Rising is we're a long-term play, because you take a kid who's a junior in high school. We've actually had some chapters around the country that are working at the middle school level. But you take a kid in junior in high school and get them on the path to be a teacher. It's a 6-year investment through community, through college and back into the community. Mm-hmm. So what we're seeing is great interest in using our materials to get folks who are paraeducators and substitute teachers into the teaching profession, which actually Montgomery County has a pretty good track record of really with SEIU Local 500 has, I'm really impressed with what they've always done around workforce development. So we're trying to pivot, or not pivot, but enhance what we're doing by also attending to the needs or attending to the market of paraeducators.
That pipeline.
We're hoping to do that, yeah. But we're a long-term play. We're not an immediate solution, right? We're not an alt-cert program. We're about a long-term investment that a community needs to make in its education workforce. So I'm hoping that people will recognize that while we may need some immediate solutions, we also need some more fundamental ones through having Ed Rising academies throughout the country.
Yeah. So I try to end these. I like to end these interviews on a positive note. We can get in the weeds talking about pandemic stuff. So what kind of silver linings have you experienced with teachers and schools since distance learning began?
It reinforces the love that teachers have for their jobs and their commitment to their kids. So we had an experience, and I tweeted about this with my son's math teacher. And it was really interesting. He needed some extra help and she was fabulous with it. And, she met with him on a Saturday morning over Zoom. Right. And she also was talking about the way she didn't really know him because she doesn't see him in class. And you realize how much teachers love their, no, not every teacher. But so many, they just love their work though. And we don't see that enough. And that's why I love kids, right? And there's something about working with kids and working with adults who love kids. And this notion of there's just something about the public good that's so powerful with education. And I hope that more people are recognizing how fundamentally important public education is to a democracy. I think that there's been this, this counter, how do I say this? Given the political context that exists, we also see what the absence of civics education has done to us and our kids. And you wonder, I think these questions are out there in some ways. I hope, again, if we see a decrease in over-reliance on standardized testing, if we see an investment in teacher leadership, if folks rally around the equity issues, maybe we can come out and say, you know what, this is a horrible, horrible year, and we can and must be better for it. That's like my glass is half full kind of thinking.
No, I love it. I public schools and public school systems can sometimes seem like big cruise ships that are hard to move. And I was just interviewing I interviewed Rick Wormley just the other day, and he talked about the analogy of obviously fire. A wildfire is not, always positive. The natural way that forest regenerates is through forest fires, and maybe this is our proverbial fire to say that we need to shift our practices and try to do things better in the future. So
but it's going to take enlightened leadership. And the challenge is the politics of the way local decisions get made. Is going to require leaders at the superintendent level, at the system level, at the school level, who will withstand not only the privilege and entitlement that's always exercised, but also know how to organize the people who are closest to the work to do the work. And they haven't been trained that way. They haven't, that's not been the incentive structure. And I don't know that they will know how to do it. And I also think, quite frankly, and I know this is, this is public, but I do think that the role of unions during all of this has been interesting. I think we need to take a really hard look at how to work effectively and have effective decision-making processes with our unions in order to respond to the needs of kids.
Yeah, well said. Well, Dr. Starr, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Pandemic Pass. Your insight is super valuable, and we look forward to having you on Ed's Not Dead again, or on Ed's Not Dead for the first time coming up. And I hope you'll join us. So thanks a lot for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Really happy to do it, Casey.
Thank you for joining us on Pandemic Pass. Pandemic Pass is a pulp education production and was written and directed by me, Casey Siddons. Music was written and performed by Peter Craven. Thanks for listening. Be sure to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. It helps others find us.